Welcome to 1315, the podcast that teaches teens to pursue Christ and defend their faith in everyday life. My name is Caleb Eckerd, and I'm the co-founder of the ministry Grounds for Faith. I'm sitting down with some of the brightest minds that follow Christ to answer the hardest questions, talk to them about what they've learned along the way, and find out what encouragements they might have for the next generation of believers. With that being said, why don't you go ahead and grab yourself a cup of coffee, have a sit, and start listening. Good morning, and thank you for sitting down with us today. It's Caleb Eckerd here again with y'all today, and I've got a very special guest that we all know and love.
Yo!
Welcome back, Ben Young. All right, we're very excited for today's episode.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of one that's in a way close to our heart because me and Ben have experienced this personally, and that just makes it mean a little bit more to us. So our question today actually comes from a viewer of ours, and this said viewer received a Bible.
Yeah, they did, because they asked a question on the post that we made that we were giving away apologetic Bibles, study Bibles, I should say. Very inquisitive.
Yeah, so if you want to know more about that opportunity, you can go and check out the Grounds for Faith page. But ultimately, really what it is that if you submit a question to the podcast, we will answer that question, and you will have the opportunity to win an apologetics study Bible. So it's really great. It's a great resource. I love it. Ben loves it. And it's something that we really recommend that everybody use.
And you can send that question in on the website, or even comment right below under the podcast. Just anywhere you submit a question, we'll see it and answer it.
Yep. Okay, so Ben, do you want to go ahead and do you want to go in ahead and read our question for today that we're going to be addressing?
Okay. All right. So here's the question. So why does God put roadblocks in our lives sometimes? Example, you're serving the Lord on a mission trip and you lose a large amount of money, or someone significant to you dies unexpectedly. So why does God put roadblocks in our lives? Is the question.
Awesome. So where do you want to start with kind of tackling this? I think, kind of asks about the missions aspect, and so I think that's something that's close to us. So do you that's kind of relates to your it relates to your experiences this summer. So
yeah, I guess we can talk overseas about that, I guess. So the attitude that I try to have going overseas on a mission trip is, I'm doing this for the Lord. I've put my plans out there for God. I've put my life out there for Him. And so the things that come up, I try to always make sure that I point it back to Him, whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing. Now, losing your money overseas, that presents quite a problem because of the currency difference and all. And so that would be quite a roadblock. But I think just trusting in God through it all, especially on a mission trip, it's sometimes easier for me to stay in that mindset than over here where I'm in my house and I'm in my comfort zone in the community I grew up in. And so things are supposed to go the way that I want them to go. While overseas, I'm not always expecting things to go correctly. But that's not to say things aren't frustrating. But it's easier for me to keep God in sight, when something goes wrong overseas, because I'm in that mindset all the time of God's got me. So,
right. So how have you seen that, kind of the fruit of that mindset?
Yeah.
Of saying, that He's got it. It's, it's all good, and I'm going to be outside of my comfort zone, and that's okay. But how have you seen that carry out in your relationship with the Lord?
So I think keeping that mindset through these roadblocks that you say is so important, because instead of pushing you away from God in your relationship, it kind of pulls you into God in your relationship, because you're like, something comes your way and you're like, God, I know you've got me. I know you've got your back. I know I'm trusting in you. And it kind of, And then you see good come from that. You might see, a loved one dies, but you get to share the gospel with someone at the funeral, or someone asks about this loved one that they knew a lot that passed away, and you get to share the gospel with them because they asked, hey, why is this person, always so happy? And, I want to know what that source was. And so there's good that comes through it. And that's easy. It's easy to say when you're not going through stuff. But definitely I've seen the fruit of being obedient, and even the fruit of the roadblocks that God has put in my life. So,
yeah, I think kind of the hard thing is determining what drives somebody in. So if there are two people that are going through the exact same situation, it's very likely, or there's the potential that one person going through the exact same situation could be drawn to Christ, while another person that's going through the exact same situation is pushed away.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say are the key characteristics between someone what's the response of somebody that allows that to push them away from God, and someone that allows that situation to push them towards God?
I think that's a good question. I think it comes down to, what are you really trusting in? And sometimes that question doesn't always apply because, well, it does apply, but I think in our human nature, it's hard for us to put all of our trust in God a lot of times. Mm. And when things don't go our way, which we expect them to go our way, especially in America where, things are good, everything's good. It's so hard to have a change of events and still be like, God's got my back. And, so when you decide to let that push you away from God, and that's your choice, that's not the event that's causing that. That's your reaction to the event that's causing that. And so you decide how you react to something. And so your reaction could be one of, hey, this isn't how I planned it to go. And so you're like, well, I'm going to blame God for it. Well, that's not the right response. You've decided, if you've put your trust in Him, you've decided to make that decision. So I'd say that's one of the responses for that. So,
yeah. And I think you kind of mentioned how, you get frustrated with God that it hasn't gone your way. You see this event as if things haven't gone the way that you expected them to. And that's kind of essentially where this trial or this frustration comes from. But when it doesn't go the way you expected it, or the way that you wanted it to, what's the underlying assumption there?
The underlying assumption
what underlying assumption are you making when you get frustrated that it didn't go the way you expected it or the way you wanted it to?
That it wasn't God's plan, I guess. You're making the assumption that your plan was God's plan.
Yeah, I think I agree exactly. I think that when we get frustrated at those things, we're getting frustrated because we're assuming that our way is the best way. Mm-hmm. And so when God says, no, I'm not going to do it that way, we get really irritated and annoyed. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't say anything about God.
Yeah.
All it says is that he's got the perfect long-term vision. Mm-hmm. No other plan is going to supersede his. So I think if we really look at that and we keep that in mind when we're going through this problem, it really gives us perspective in saying that, okay, these things don't, because people would say that things like this kind of disprove God. Because if God was good and He really wanted you to be successful in international missions or with your ministry, why would bad things happen? Is essentially kind of the root of the question. Mm-hmm. And that's just assuming that it's the way it's supposed to be when it's done your way. Mm-hmm. And it just isn't.
And I think, Isaac, another thing to think about is, so you think, oh, well, why would a loving God allow someone I dearly love and care for to pass away, or allow me to lose money on a mission trip when I've gone overseas to, worship him? It's something I think about is, okay, well, we know that in our flesh we are sinful as men. And so how can God be loving if he always lets us get what we want, things go our way? How can that be loving? Because we all know that many times our plans are not the correct way to go about things. They're not the best things for us. And so that's something I think about, how is God loving us through this? And also, it builds so much trust. I mean, when you go through circumstances, like Caleb said, there's those two responses. You are pushed away from God, or you're pulled towards him, and your reaction to that. And so, something happens. I think if you make that decision to trust God and realize that he holds the universe and he holds your life in his hand, and, everything's a blessing. Every day is a blessing. I think that it grows you closer to him as you trust him, and you look for those good things that come out of the bad things. Because if you're not looking for the good things, you're not always going to see them, because they're not always going to be huge. And so you start to look for those good things. So I'd say that's another aspect.
Yeah. So how do we, we kind of have this, and we have this information. We know that just because something bad happens doesn't really necessarily, it doesn't disprove or discount the goodness of God at all. It just further proves the fact that his way is the best way, and his ways are higher than our ways, and we're not really gonna truly understand until we won't understand the big picture until we die and we get to heaven and we're like, oh, I get it now. Mm-hmm. Or at least I get it way more than I did beforehand. So how do we take that information, and how do we apply that to our lives in a way that we can share the gospel with other people?
Take and apply the responses. I don't know if I followed your question.
So how does that situation, you're going through, something bad happens, and you're like, well, okay, this stinks, but God's got it. How do you take that and use
to share the gospel?
Yeah, how do you use that to share the gospel with other people?
Yeah, so that brings up another good point. I think so if you choose to have that positive attitude, that trust in God, and something, unexpected does happen to you in your life, say you have one of your loved ones dies, and I'm your best friend over here, and you're like, you still have this optimistic view on things, and I would be pretty confused. I would be like, well, aren't you kind of sad? Aren't you upset? Aren't you mad? And so your positive outlook on the event would be in itself a message to me about, the God that you trust, and the hope that you have in him, the trust that you have in him, that without you saying anything, it's just strictly your actions. And so then through that would cause me to ask you a question about that. Hey man, are you okay? You seem kind of like too happy for this. And then that question triggers, your testimony right into that and sharing the gospel. And so, I think that's a good point. Like we said before, those good things that come from the events, oftentimes it's getting to share the gospel with people. And if, you take that positive outlook on that, these people realize, wow, not every bad thing is actually a bad thing, and wow, there's good that came from this. God's really in control. He was, he had this event, he was holding this event. And so, I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, for real. And I think, for me, that is my testimony. I came to know Christ because something bad happened, and it could have been awful, and it could have been, horrific, but because of that, I know Christ, and because of that, I get to do what I'm doing right now. So I think in that regard, like, there are much bigger things at stake than just, just making it through the event.
Yeah.
And what Ben's talking about doesn't mean that you don't experience emotion. That's the exact opposite of what Ben is saying. He's not saying that you have to, even when something horrible happens, you can't be mad, you can't be upset, you can't be frustrated, you can't be confused. That's not what he's saying, but he's saying that kind of like the root of those emotions all tie back to joy in Christ, and it still points you back to Christ. So with that being said, I think another aspect of that, of how answering this question of why does God allow these things to happen, is kind of rooted in that, and it's the fact that these things don't really dictate your emotions, and if you allow them to, you're not going to be able to share the gospel. So on an internal level, these things allow you to have the focus, have the mindset to remain focused on the calling that we have, and that's to share the gospel with other people.
Yeah.
And if we're disconnected from that, I mean, all bets are off. Like, it's really hard. When your head is in the right or in the wrong place, it's near impossible to share the gospel in a way that excites you or makes you want to do it again. Or
because if you're sharing the gospel and you're not joyful about it, that's not very convincing, and so the attitude you have, even when you're carrying your life out with someone you shared the gospel with, they need to see that transformation in your life, not just you're telling them, hey, this is the gospel. That's great that you had the courage to share the gospel, but you need to live it out too. Because if I'm a unbeliever and I'm thinking about Christianity, I'm looking at, having this relationship with God, I'm going to want to know, what are your actions, not just what are you telling me? What are you actually doing? So.
Yeah, and I think that's a good word from Acts 4. So if you have the time, go read that. When Peter's standing before the council and they're talking to him, the first thing that they mention is that they knew that they had been with Christ and that they followed Christ because of the things that they were preaching and that they were saying. But ultimately, they were saying this is what they were saying, and this is how we know they were believers. But then there's like a whole separate break. It's a whole new sentence where they say, and we know that they're believers by the actions that they've done. And it amazed me how clear and cut and dry that was, reading through Acts 4. So go ahead for sure and check that out. Ben, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I think just keep, when those things come through, keep that positive outlook and look for the good out of that God is providing, especially with sharing your testimony, if that may come.
Yeah, and ultimately it doesn't say, when things don't go the way that we expect them to, it doesn't say anything about the God we serve, but it does, how we react says something about where our heart is at and where our focus is. So keep that in mind. Don't assume that your way is the best way or your plans are the best plans, because they're not always, and most of the time they're not. So definitely just cling to the Lord through that. I hope y'all like the new intro. That was a lot of fun to make.
Oh, yeah.
Ben will attest, it took me forever to pick out the music. So welcome to the new podcast. We got some really exciting ones coming up soon, so I hope you'll stay tuned from that. Also, go check out groundsforfaith.com. That's grounds, 4faith.com. A lot of awesome resources out there, blog posts each week, sometime more in a week. They're really great, and we got a lot of really cool stuff coming up, so you'll want to definitely stay tuned for that. This is Caleb.
This is Ben.
And we're signing off with 1315. Make sure you check out next week, every Friday. Thanks.